Hello and welcome to our special coverage of the Russian invasion. I'm Ladi Akiridulwale. The headlines. NATO leaders warn Russia against use of chemical weapons in Ukraine. U.S. President Joe Biden to meet with refugees at the Polish-Ukraine border. Plus, what next for African students who were able to flee the conflict in Ukraine? Ukraine's leader, Volodymyr Zelensky, is accusing European leaders of being too late in acting against Russia since the invasion of his country started. In his usual late-night address to the European Council summit in Brussels, he outlined Russia's destruction and damage to the country and thanked Europe for uniting in its support. But then in his characteristic forthright style, he told the European leaders that they had acted too late to stop Russia. Thankful for the sanctions applied, Mr. Zelensky said, but that were a bit too late, adding that if there had been preventive sanctions, perhaps Russia wouldn't have gone to war. He also pointed to the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline, where he suggested if it had been blocked earlier, Russia would not have created a gas crisis. In recent weeks, Mr. Zelensky has made many speeches to parliaments around the world, and he has not been afraid to chide the West for what he sees as its failure to deliver enough support. Meanwhile, U.S. President Joe Biden will be traveling to a town near the Polish-Ukrainian border on the final leg of his four-day European trip. Air Force One is expected to land in the Polish town of Rezo, a few kilometers from the Ukrainian border. During his visit there, Mr. Biden is expected to meet with members of the U.S. 82nd Airborne Division, part of NATO's increasingly muscular deployment to its eastern flank. Yesterday, the U.S. president had joined NATO leaders in their discussions on Russia, saying that if Russia were to use chemical weapons in its invasion of Ukraine, the United States would respond. Mr. Biden also said that China understands its economic future is more closely tied to the West than to Russia, after warning Beijing it could face consequences for aiding Moscow's war in Ukraine.
We would respond. We would respond if he uses it. The nature of the response would depend on the nature of the use. I had a very straightforward conversation with Xi now, I guess it's 6 days ago, 7 days ago, in that range. And I made it clear to him, I made no threats, but I made it clear to him that make sure he understood the consequences of him helping Russia. China understands that its economic future is much more closely tied to the West than it is to Russia. And so I'm hopeful that he does not get engaged.
For the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, he says he is absolutely not anti-Russian, and NATO members viewed the notion of chemical, biological, tactical nuclear weapons being used in Ukraine with, quote, utter horror. Speaking to reporters following a meeting in Brussels with NATO leaders, Mr. Johnson rebuffed the Kremlin's statement that he was the most active anti-Russian leader.
I think it's very, very important for everybody to understand that I don't think there's a single person round the table in NATO or the G7 who is against Russians or the Russian people. Absolutely not. Least of all me. I think I'm probably the only Prime Minister in UK history to be called Boris. But I think what we all agree is that what Vladimir Putin is doing, the way he's leading Russia at the moment, is utterly catastrophic. That his invasion of Ukraine is inhuman and barbaric. So you can be sympathetic towards ordinary Russians who are being so badly led, but you can be deeply hostile to the decisions of Vladimir Putin, the way he's leading his country. Chemical, biological, tactical, nuclear weapons, all of these are viewed with utter horror by people around the table today. I think that if Putin were to engage in anything like that, the consequences would be very, very severe. You have to have a bit of ambiguity about your response, but I think it would be catastrophic for him if he were to do that. I think Joe Biden is right to warn, because when the Russians start doing this stuff about oh well, there are factories in Ukraine producing American biological weaponry, that is a prelude to a false flag operation, and they could well do something. And all discussion of nuclear weapons is intended to frame this as a confrontation between Russia as a nuclear power and other nuclear powers. That's not what's going on. What's going on is a confrontation between Russia and entirely innocent people in Ukraine. That's what it's between. And what we're trying to do is help those people. And I think that is morally the right thing to do.
At the summit itself, the NATO leaders agreed to strengthen their defenses in the east in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The announcement was made by Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, whose role as NATO chief has been extended for another year. During a news conference after the meeting, he expressed concerns about Russia's accusation on Ukraine and allies as an excuse to use chemical weapons.
Concerned, partly because we see the rhetoric and we see that Russia is trying to create some kind of pretext accusing Ukraine, United States, NATO allies for preparing to use chemical and biological weapons. And we have seen before that this way of accusing others is actually a way to create a pretext for do the same themselves. And of course, the accusations against Ukraine and NATO allies are absolutely false.
Chemical, biological, radiological, and...
Let's talk to military strategist, former Chief of Defense Research and Development, and also former Commander of Operation Safe Haven, Major General Henry Ayola. Thank you for your time. Welcome to the program this morning.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you. Good morning, viewers.
What do you make of the way this war has unfolded so far? There's been so much back and forth, and there are people who say that, well, the Russians were caught unawares. There are others who say that the Ukrainians will eventually have to give this up. But as a military man, what's your reading of what has happened so far a month down the line?
Thank you so very much. Well, I like to back up a little, looking at Russia, the strategic importance of Russia, knowing that the Russian Federation is the vestige of the old Soviet Union, and that used to have a great power status, and that, of course, lots of that status was not something that was welcomed by all Russians in particular. And if you look at the sentiments and the mien of President Putin, you see that it's somebody who is, well, let's say, suffering from the fantasies and the nostalgia of that loss of great power status of the former Soviet Union. So you find is somebody like trying to catch up with something that he really loved and that is lost. And so, and of course, he's the aggressor here. So I don't know why it will be difficult to say he was not prepared, because he's the aggressor. He chose the time, he chose the objectives, he chose, the other side of the belligerent. So it cannot be. I mean, he's the most prepared. He's the one who chose. He had the freedom of action, being the aggressor. Okay, so for me, it's like a setback for the world, because most international watchers will think that the world has gone beyond this level, where one global or regional or local hegemon can just get up and, violate all the international laws, all the jus cogens, things that are taken as sacrosanct, and just go all out to start attacking in a war of aggression. I think this gives a classical example of a war of aggression. I remember in 1998 when the Rome Statutes first came out, there was issue about defining, war crimes and war of aggression in particular. I think this Putin's case provides a locus classicus for that definition. So for me, I think it's a challenge to the international community. It just means that men are still men after all. That yeah, as far as the human civilization has come, there are still men who are not very much at home with the civility and the level of development that have occurred in the world so far. Okay, so that's my take up in issue, talking about Putin. So my concern really was, I took a quick look at the Russian Federation Constitution, because I was concerned, what is their procedure and process of declaring war in the Russian Federation? Because, I mean, it shouldn't be just one man who can decide to go to war or not to go to war. And really, looking at their constitution, looking at their National Security Council, looking at their national military doctrine, I tried to put together, and I really couldn't, lay my finger on any clear-cut, procedure and process for declaring war. And so it appears to me that it's a dangerous thing that we have a nation as powerful, as strategically important as Russia is, but I do not have democratic processes and procedure for doing things, and that leaves a lot of power to one man. And that, to a large extent, is playing out in this situation. And of course, if I look at the people in the National Security Council, what I could see that there's what we call a group think in strategic and security cycle. Group think is a situation where everybody in the group is thinking alike, and there are no dissent voices, there are no different opinions. Groupthink is something that came to the fore by the intelligence community of Israel in the 70s, particularly after the Yom Kippur War. It became clear that one of the lessons learned was that the intelligence community had a particular model of thinking, and it was like nobody could do anything different or say anything different. That's obvious here. I mean, you will have wondered by now, nobody is expressing any different, opinion, no dissent. Even from the Duma and the National Council. I mean, what was their role in deciding whether to attack Ukraine or not? So that's an issue to look at. There's so many issues that have been thrown up here. The issue of sovereignty of nations, the issue of national integrity, of course, of Ukraine in this setting, the issue of national pride and national interest, all of them are coming to the fore, because if you look at the demands that Putin and Russia is putting forward, I mean, they are quite, maybe to put it mildly, humiliating for a nation to tell another nation to say, look, don't defend yourself, call off your military, demilitarize your land, accept Crimea and the Donbas region as part of Russia, putting forward things that will virtually reduce the other nation to a vassal state to you, So no nation worth a sword, no nation with any modicum of national pride will submit to those demands, So
let me interrupt you. Let me interrupt you and ask this. I mean, when you started your answer to this question, you said, let's go back a little. And there are those who would also point to the other side of this argument, which is that the Russians have also been fairly long-suffering and that they have accepted people riding roughshod over them for quite a while, in the sense that when the Soviet Union broke up and Russia and all these other republics emerged, there was an agreement with the West that militarily, the West would not seek to incorporate the former Soviet republics into its orbit, and that was not respected, that was not obeyed by the Western countries, NATO and the EU in particular, and that they went on and incorporated Poland, they incorporated Slovenia, they incorporated Slovakia, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and that the Ukraine is at the doorstep of Russia. So it was the Ukrainian situation that made Russia call a halt, that it wasn't going to accept what it had already accepted down the years with all these other countries that I named?
Yes, I agree with you to a large extent on that. But of course, some have argued that that so-called agreement actually was in relation to Eastern Germany. That once the unification of Eastern and Western Germany took place, they will not go further, to extend eastward. But again, it comes down to the issue of sovereignty of nations. There are about 14 nations of the former Soviet Union that have joined NATO since then. Yeah, granted. Yeah, I agree also that I think NATO has done what I could call an overreach. Because again, there's a big lesson there that no matter how powerful you are either as a supranational body or as a single nation, there must be caution in the way you project power. There must be, respect for other nations. I mean, I agree with you to a large extent that some have argued, even, Senator, the man in the US who was a former presidential candidate.
Bernie Sanders. You're referring to Bernie Sanders.
Yeah, Senator Sanders, thank you very much. I'd argue that if anybody, like it happened, of course, in 1962 when the Soviet Union brought missiles to Cuba. We know the Cuban missile crisis, how it happened. Of course, America responded. And that's part of what I started when I said, look, we must give some respect to Russia. Apart from that nostalgia, Russia is still a strong nation. I mean, there are too many indices that make Russia. Russia is the largest country in the whole world, for example. And you can see the connection of even the other parts of Europe, the dependency on Russia, gas and oil and all of that. So for a nation that has that much, strategic importance, you cannot treat it like just any other, small nation. Even though all nations are supposed to be equal, but we all know that's in theory. There are indices of power, perceived power of nations, and so I think NATO has that lesson to learn and to tread with caution subsequently after this. Hopefully that we all will have learned sufficient lesson at the end of this, hoping that it will stop at some stage right. In fact, that's another concern I have to try to figure out what is the strategic end state of Russia's invasion. At what point will they come and say, okay, we have achieved our aim of this war? I mean, apart from the demands being put out and apart from the package propaganda that the President Putin put out to his people, why they are attacking, all of those, some of which are of course are not obtrusive, So, but looking at the way the war has been going on, you ask yourself, the apparent or perceived or seeming strategic leading edge that Russia has over Ukraine, it doesn't seem to be playing out in their favor. I mean, up till now, they've not been able to capture Kyiv. And, some people have come out to say, oh, okay, maybe the strategic end state is to capture Kyiv, demilitarize or reduce or degrade the Russian military. And then, of course, maybe install a new Russian-friendly government in Kyiv and all of that. Of course, there are many possibilities, there are many options one can, look at talking about that. So that when you get to that point, then you can say, oh, we have achieved our strategic end state, and hence we can call it off. Now, so that's still something, analysts are cracking their heads to see, and to be able to say at what point we expect Russia to call it a quit. But for me, the lessons learned for me, one of the lessons for me, and I think this for Russia in particular. Now, I think President Putin and his cabinet need to get smart. This is exactly what happened that led to the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Now, most analysts will agree that the Soviet Union actually lost the economic war that US pushed it into. It was, the Soviet Union was lured into a strategic, balance or war balance and a strategic race and, and all of that. But with a subtle economic race, which the Soviet Union lost. Again, you can see the economy of Russia is being affected by all the sanctions now. Let's even take, for example, possibly that they capture Kyiv, install a new government. For how long? How would they sustain that? For how long? And then, of course, the economy will continue to go down until when they will make the same mistake the old Soviet Union made, and they will lose the economic war, and they will go down. And of course, things will never be the same for them again. So my advice is that they should look for one point right now, because it's a month now. Today is 24th, isn't it? A month
25th.
that this war started. Okay, and I mean, looking at the fact that Ukraine is not a near peer competitor with Russia, and yet you can see the determination of the people. You can see the acute leadership being displayed by their president, and the people have been able to hold out against Russia. And of course, I have always taken, stood on that ground that no matter how strong you are, even the war between an ant and an elephant cannot be taken for granted. And that's playing out here. And you could see that the Ukrainians are determined. Of course, there's national pride involved in this, and of course, having a leader who could then stay in front and keep the resistance going. So I think Russia should quickly review the situation, look at a major objective that they have captured, and use that as their main end state, and call it a quit. And of course, they have the propaganda machine to say, yeah, we have won the war, haven't accomplished
this goals, indeed.
And go home. Okay?
General Ayola, thank you so much for this perspective. I wish we had more time to be able to explore it in full. General Henry Ayola is former Chief of Defense Research and Development in the Nigerian Armed Forces, and also former commander of Operation Safe Haven. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much, Lady.
The second month has started. That's after Russia invaded Ukraine. Many Ukrainian cities have been destroyed by rocket attacks, captured, or are still under siege. The resistance of the Ukrainian army, coupled with international support, has of course slowed down the advance of Russian troops. Unprecedented severe sanctions have hit Russia's economy. The United Nations estimates report that more than 5 million refugees have already left Ukraine. Here's a look back at 1 month since this invasion happened.
On February 24, Russian President Vladimir Putin launched what he called a special military operation against Ukraine, marking the start of the biggest military offensive in Europe since World War II. After Russian armed forces were unable to seize control of Ukraine with the lightning offensive in the first week of the war, they shifted strategy to the bombardment of cities with artillery, airstrikes and missiles. And on February 27th, with little progress made in Moscow's offensive, President Putin put Russia's nuclear forces on high alert, citing aggressive statements by NATO members and the financial sanctions. The dramatic move is seen as a warning to NATO not to intervene in Ukraine. Ukraine says civilian targets, including hospitals, churches and housing, have been hit, but Russia has denied targeting civilians. Russian forces have repeatedly struck the capital, Kiev, but have failed to encircle the city. The besieged southern port city of Mariupol has been hardest hit, subject to weeks of bombardment that has killed at least 2,300 people and destroyed most of the city, according to Ukrainian officials. About 100,000 civilians remain trapped in the city without running water, electricity or heating, and with supplies of food dwindling. Only one major city, Kherson, has fallen to the Russians. People in the city have staged protests against the Russian occupation. They've been met with tear gas and gunfire. Russian forces have also seized 2 Ukrainian nuclear power plants in the country, including the largest in Europe. The United States has formally asserted that Russia's forces have committed war crimes in Ukraine, and President Joe Biden has accused Russian President Vladimir Putin of being a war criminal.
Nato and in the Pacific.
The International Criminal Court has launched an investigation into possible war crimes. On the diplomatic front, Ukraine and Russia signaled they might be nearing an agreement on March 16th, But talks are dragging on, a reflection of the difficulty Ukraine faces in giving up aspects of its self-determination, such as joining the EU or NATO, and parts of its sovereign territory, including the Donbass region and Russia-annexed Crimea. Meanwhile, various countries around the world like Turkey, Israel, China, and South Africa have stepped in to try and mediate in the situation. The United Nations says more than 3.6 million Ukrainians have now fled the country, and a further 6.5 million have been displaced within Ukraine. The war's death toll is unclear, but Ukrainian President Zelensky, who has become a symbol of national resistance, said on Wednesday that thousands of people have been killed, including at least 121 Ukrainian children. The war has also rattled the global economy and the geopolitical order. Economic sanctions on a scale never before placed on a $1.5 trillion economy are set to send Russia into deep recession this year. The World Bank warns the country is now in default territory. Russia, go home! Russia, go home! Solidarity for Ukraine has been immense, with thousands across the world, many visibly emotional, taking to the streets to denounce Russia's invasion of its neighbor, Ukraine.
World support Ukraine! World support Ukraine! World support Ukraine! In another consequence of this month-long war, African students who have managed to flee are left wondering what next, as the war there has upended their education. South African student Nkateko Muyimane and 6 fellow African students hid in a subway while Russian shells pounded Kharkiv before fleeing on a train to Budapest. They very nearly failed to board. Now their main concern is how to salvage the degrees they have sacrificed so much to start. As the war continued to ravage, different governments ordered an evacuation of their citizens, mainly students. The students are now concerned about how they will salvage the degrees that they have put up so much to get.
There is no university in Ukraine. It's literally smithereens. It's been bombed down and, turned into rubbles. So, yeah, we're basically sitting ducks. We do continue online. Medicine is practical, you need to be physically there with the patient and, yeah. So I feel like we are disrupted in that sense. And the sooner we do get integrated into a system, if it's possible, then we can do some sacrifice a lot, I must make a plan, to continue my studies. Medicine is my dream. I remember as a small black child, growing up and watching my dad go to work. He's a medical doctor, that inspired me, to want to help people, to do better, So I really do want to do it for other people too. Having gone through the hardships of war, it makes it more of a purpose to fulfill my dream.
I remember thinking when I was right in front of the gate, wait, is this where I die? Because I didn't have any more energy and I was literally about to pass out. And I was just wondering, I was like, because they closed the gates just 2 people before I entered. And I was not feeling well at that point. I knew something was wrong. I tried signaling some of the soldiers, but if their commander has closed the gate, it's on command they can open the gate. So that went on deaf ears. And I was just standing there and I couldn't do anything. So I just closed my eyes and I was just in the air. I was basically standing because of how compact we were. So the people in front of me, behind me, they were keeping me standing at that point.
We have joining us now Dr. Raymond Ekpobodo. He is the General Secretary of the Nigerians in Diaspora Organization in Russia. Thank you so much for your time. Welcome to the program this morning.
Thank you very much.
The living conditions in light of the sanctions imposed on Russia and also the plight of students, especially Nigerians, what can you tell us about that? It's been a month now since this war started. What can you tell us about that?
Okay. First of all, let me thank you for inviting me for this your channel. And of course, it's all about the sanction. And after the sanction, what people are afraid of, because people are panicked, people are afraid of the sanction that lead to all this issue that is on ground. So definitely students are worried about what is happening here. Even the parents of the students, they are worried back home in Nigeria. So far so good. The needle in the diaspora, the European needle, and also the needle in Russia and the embassy, they are being on ground to set some mechanism on ground on how to help the Nigerians who are in Russia. And at the same time, we also have students from other countries, which is where the incident is happening, which is the Ukraine. The embassy is also there combined with different NGOs formed by Nigerians that are in Russia to make sure they help Nigerians to have a fair landing in Russia.
When we spoke to some of those who are in Russia, they did point out, the president of the Students' Union of the Friendship University in Moscow pointed out that some universities in Russia have, in fact, indicated their willingness to take many of the students whose studies have been disrupted by the situation in Ukraine. What can you tell us about that?
In this aspect, I, for one, have been on ground helping students before this time, before the crisis. And different universities have been on ground to receive students from Ukraine. And as you know, many of these students that are from Ukraine, they prefer to move to Europe, where they can further their education. But those ones that are ready or willing to come to Russia, we are on ground to put them in different universities to make sure that they are all admitted to university to complete their education in Russia.
Now, the situation which I started with when we talked about sanctions, what is life like on the ground in Moscow? You're joining us from Moscow. One can imagine that with war in neighboring Ukraine, things change. Is that true?
In my own opinion, and what I'm seeing here, we are living normally in Russia. So, you know, some of this information, they are not filtered before they were published on the social media. So people are getting information, not correct information. But we that are here in Russia, things are normal. You go to the market, you buy things as normal. So you can see that for some days now, the rubles is even gaining a value. You understand? So it means that things are not so difficult as the way people see out there. So things, people should, what I would suggest that people should mind the kind of information they get from the social media, at the same time to work on the social media to make sure that they get authentic information, especially we that are in Russia, see on ground, seeing what is happening, and we know very well that it's not as the way people think about it, that things are difficult in Russia. Things are normal in Russia. Normal work is going on. People are going to work, and every other thing, activities are working smoothly in Russia, irrespective of their various work.
Finally, before I let you go, and when you talk about authentic information, it brings to mind how you are able to source this authentic information that we talk about. The relationship, you mentioned it in the answer to the first question, but I want you to expatiate on that a little bit. How cooperative, how supportive have the authorities, the Nigerian High Commission in Moscow, the embassy in Ukraine, and other such bodies been to organizations like Nato in the attempt to ensure that the passage or the staying, the transfer of students and other citizens who are affected by this crisis is fairly smooth in Russia has been?
Okay, yeah, the embassy, like as I said earlier, the embassy has been on ground in this situation. So what are the mechanisms set on ground? We have different organizations like the Lido Russia. We have the federal government student scholarship team. We also have the private student team. We also have different organizations that are grant, so that if any student that able to cross the border from Ukraine to Russia, they can contact these people and make sure that they get received in Russia.
Final question. Do you know if there are still any Nigerians, students or professionals who have not been able to leave Russia, leave the Ukraine at this point in time?
Definitely, there will still be Nigerian students, because I cannot say totally they are all evacuated from Ukraine. If I say that, it means I'm lying the public. So they are still students, because yesterday one of the students called me and he told me he was managed to move to Poland, and he was in a deportation, he was in a refugee camp, and he doesn't have a passport. So later I told him that for you to get your passport, please, can you forward me your information, which he did, but later he told me that he has been free from the refugee camp and gained freedom.
So this is an ongoing exercise, shall we say then. But I want to thank you so much, Dr. Ekpobodo, for your time on the program this morning. I wish you the best of luck as you continue to help Nigerians and indeed citizens of other countries who are caught up in this conflict. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, sir. You're welcome.
U.S. Energy Secretary Jennifer Granholm says the U.S. and its allies are discussing possible further coordinated release of oil from storage to help calm oil markets in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. IEA member states agreed to release over 60 million barrels of oil reserves earlier this month in a bid to cool rising prices, which have hit the cost of living and spurred inflation. Brent crude oil prices traded around $120 a barrel yesterday, well above the $105 price on the day of the last release. Speaking alongside Ms. Granholm, IEA Executive Director Fatih Birol says the earlier release constituted just 4% of the total storage of its member countries, which include 31 mostly industrialized countries, but not Russia.
It looks like the supplies will be, there's a response by the oil and gas market. It looks like oil supplies will increase by about 1 million barrels per year. At least our Energy Information Agency has a short-term energy outlook that has been updated to include those increases. That is not all that will be required, clearly. There's more to be able to do. And then just with respect to the emergency stockpiles, I think that was actually probably to you, but I'll just say that I think these are ongoing discussions, and all those tools are certainly on the table.
Our release, 63 million barrels, was an initial release. Our member countries and the Secretariat are closely monitoring the markets. And in addition to this initial release, if our member countries decide so, we are immediately ready to act and release additional volumes to the markets. One shouldn't forget that 63 million barrels were only 4% of all the stocks we have. And in case of a need, if our countries decide that there is a need, we will be happy immediately to act and bring the volumes to the markets.
South Africa's central bank lifted its benchmark interest rate for a third straight meeting and signaled it will raise borrowing costs more aggressively through 2024, in part to counter inflationary pressures stemming from Russia's war with Ukraine. The implied policy rate path of the central bank's quarterly projection model, which the Monetary Policy Committee uses as a guide, now indicates a key rate of 5.06% by year-end, compared with its January forecast of 4.91%. The repurchase rate, known as repo rate, is now seen at 6.68% by the end of 2024, up from 6.55%. Let's talk to Laddie Williams to unpack some of this. Laddie Williams, of course, our business correspondent. Good morning. Laddie, morning.
Yeah.
What does this mean?
So this is the, the headache right now, for central bankers all over the world. Even before the war, inflation was already on the way up. And now this war has even stoked inflation, even more. And we're seeing, central bankers now thinking, you know what, we have to make a decision. Do we sacrifice, economic growth, to tackle inflation at this point? So we've seen Ghana raise rates, we've seen Egypt raise rates, and now South Africa is the next to raise rates, and that means a borrowing cost has now gone up so that they can try and, tame inflation at this point. The war, obviously, we're seeing everything going up because of the oil,
oil prices.
Oil prices going up. So energy costs, that's propping every other thing up. Businesses are having to pay more overhead costs, at this point. So now they're now having to contend with borrowing costs now, because as rates go up, we've seen the U.S. Fed also, raise rates, at this point. So right now the battle is inflation. Now central bankers are doing all they can to tame
what you said
inflation.
earlier in the week proved prescient on that point, where you said the battle is going to be between taming inflation and trying to prevent growth from slowing down.
Because now there's a risk of recession. By the time all bankers now keep raising rates at this point, but luckily in Nigeria we didn't do that. We maintained rates at this point, but who knows what will come next.
Britain is saying it and the US is going to send more liquefied natural gas to Europe. I don't know whether that's a short-term measure or a long-term measure.
Yeah, they've termed it a transitory, measure at this point, because, they're trying to see how they can support Europe, in this transition away from reliance on Russian energy, because we know that Europe relies heavily on Russia for its gas needs. And now we've seen Putin try to use that to his advantage by saying, you know what, you're going to pay for my gas in rubles. So they're trying to see how they can support Europe at this point, with liquefied natural gas. So they're saying, okay, you know what, we'll send, that's Canada and the US, will send LNG to the UK. Then from the UK will now distribute
for the rest of Europe.
For the rest of Europe. But most of these measures will take time, at this point. And obviously we know Putin has, used this to advantage. We've seen natural gas prices go up at this point. So these are measures, but analysts are saying, you know what, some of these measures will take time. But
so the impact will not be immediate, and therefore the result will not be immediate.
Yeah, so but they're making moves, they're making plans, to reduce reliance on Russian energy.
What you said about the ruble, of course, has been my last guest, or rather my first guest and my last guest, spoke about that as well, saying that the ruble has appreciated significantly since Putin made that comment about the ruble. And the stock market in Russia, which reopened yesterday, has also meant that the ruble has appreciated.
Yeah.
Is this bucking the trend, shall we say, in spite of the sanctions?
Exactly. So basically, with this opening yesterday for the Moscow exchange, it was a limited opening. Foreigners were not able to sell, and just about 33 stocks were actually allowed to trade. But looking at, the first trading day, we saw the index, go up, but companies that had to, relations with sanctions actually still went down, on the exchange. But we saw other companies actually do well. But now, the US have come out to say, you know what, that was a charade. You cannot open an exchange, you stop traders from actually short selling, and you also limit foreigners from selling their stocks. So they're saying this is not a real market. You're just using your funds to prop up the market and to make it seem like everything is healthy at this point. But at the end of the day, the market is opened, and they're saying April 1st, foreign traders will be able to trade. It remains to be seen if that
will really happen, because that's next Friday.
Exactly.
That's about a week from today.
Yeah, so everybody's watching. We're watching the exchange. We're seeing how it's going. We'll watch how trade actually goes today. And obviously, we're seeing Putin is doing all he can to
project
support
that they have normalcy.
Exactly. Say we're all good right here in Russia, but the U.S. is calling the bluff at this time, and we're also seeing that with the sanction on their
on their gold reserves. That's
exactly
the point. The G7 has gone after Russia's gold reserves.
Yeah, because Russia has an incredible amount of gold reserves. It's worth about $140 billion, dollars at this point. So they're saying that Russia is using their gold at this point to swap for other foreign currencies that don't have
anything to do with SWIFT or the dollar.
Exactly, and they're also selling, some of that gold they're selling it to the gold markets and, some dealers at this point so that they can actually use that to, support the ruble. All of this is to make the ruble stronger, make it, gain back pace against the U.S. dollar at this point. But, the U.S. and allies are saying, you know what, we have to find a way to stop them from actually selling their gold at this point, because that's an incredible amount of gold reserves they have, and that can actually help support the ruble,
a great deal of this.
Cushion, and they're able to evade, most of the financial sanctions, with this sale of their gold. So now it's all about clamping down on Russia's gold at this point.
Ladi Williams, more to unpack every day.
Yeah,
different types of this. Business Morning and Business Incorporated. Business Morning at 10, Business Incorporated at 1:30. Ladi Anini will give you all the details. Thank you.
Thank you.
Almost 3/4 of the UN General Assembly has demanded aid access and civilian protection in Ukraine, and also criticized Russia for creating, quote, a dire humanitarian situation after Moscow invaded its neighbor over a month ago now. It's the second time the 193-member General Assembly has overwhelmingly isolated Russia over what Moscow calls a special military operation that it says is aimed at destroying Ukraine's military infrastructure. The resolution adopted yesterday, which was drafted by Ukraine and allies, received 140 votes in favor and 5 votes against Russia, Syria, North Korea, Eritrea, and Belarus, while 38 countries, including China, abstained. Ukraine and its allies had been looking to match or improve on support received for a March 2 General Assembly resolution that deplored Russia's aggression and demanded it withdrew its troops. That received 141 yes votes, the same 5 no votes, including 35 states, which of course included China, which abstained.
Let's spare the Assembly from this shame. Let's prove that the Assembly is still a solid structure, and we are the United Nations that have been wise enough to avert imminent disaster. So, pursuant to Rule 91 of the General Assembly's Rules of Procedure, we propose that the General Assembly decide not to vote on the resolution proposed by South Africa. We urge all delegations to vote against the proposal of South Africa to go ahead with the next draft. But before that, I will ask Mr. President to explain it very carefully to all of us what the vote yes and no means, so there is no confusion, because the entire design of what happens is to spread confusion in the Assembly. Thank you.
Today, once again, the world stood united. It stood united in the face of President Putin's unjustified and unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. Together, a strong majority of UN member states made clear that Russia bears sole responsibility for the grave humanitarian crisis and violence in Ukraine. Together, we called for the protection of all civilians fleeing the conflict, and for steps to mitigate the increase in food insecurity caused by this senseless war. And together, we reaffirmed the UN Charter.
And finally, it's sports, where Chelsea English Football Club will lobby the United Kingdom government to lift its ban on them selling tickets to home Premier League games. The club is baffled by the decision to single out home league matches when they now have the go-ahead to fill the seats at Champions League games. The government lifted the suspension on all European games and domestic away games, but not for league matches at Stamford Bridge. Chelsea have already agreed in conjunction with the Premier League that proceeds from all ticket sales will go to charity. And that's our program this morning. Do join us. There's an update at 5 p.m. later in the day. Amarachi Bani, Millicent Walker will have all of the stories at that time. The show will be back tomorrow at 7 in the evening when we'll have another update. But till then, have yourselves a pleasant day and a good weekend ahead. I'm Ladia Kredulwale.